So, Renato, can Trump just fire anyone he wants?
It's complicated.
I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Rachel Barco. I'm a law professor at NYU, and I have a book coming out next week called Justice Abandoned: How the Supreme Court Ignored the Constitution and Enabled Mass Incarceration.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet.
So, we have a great guest here to explain something that definitely cannot be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. Renato, I'm not sure if you took admin law.
So I'm going to make a confession. I took admin law, but I did not really attend much of admin law.
Who did you take it with?
Actually, I don't even remember. I don't even remember. But it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Admin is in there with like federal courts. You know, I've told you that I took it, and all I remember is Professor Resnick drawing a bunch of buckets on the chalkboard with arrows going from the buckets. I agree with you. Like admin, I did attend, and I think I have like a vague understanding, but you know, I know that Rachel can break it down so well because I've listened to her on other podcasts when there was a big Supreme Court case about administrative agencies. We talked a little bit about it in this podcast. And then more recently, she wrote an amazing note for Cafe Insider, and I think she's the best person to break this all down. So what is happening, Rachel? Tell us.
It's chaos. It's chaos. So I guess I'll start by saying that the basic structure in American government is we have different kinds of agencies that are all considered executive agencies, in the sense that if we have three branches of government and you had to stick these different government entities in one spot, they're not legislative, they're not judicial, and so they fall into that third bucket, which would be our executive branch. And when some of these agencies are like the Department of Treasury, they're headed by a person who is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and the president can absolutely remove those people at will. You know, they're kind of classic executive officer that presidents remove when they want to because they feel that person isn't complying with their policy directives, what have you. And there's other agencies, the head of the EPA. So there's a lot of agencies that have that basic structure. That would be the easy executive branch. That'd be the easy one to answer your question. Can the president remove those people? Yes, he can. All right. But then there's another group of agencies that are, again, they would be within the executive branch because they can't be considered legislative, they can't be considered judicial, and we have to put them in one bucket. But they're usually referred to as independent agencies. And the reason that they're referred to as independent agencies is when Congress created them, Congress created a structure that the heads of those agencies would only be removable for cause. So malfeasance, neglect of duty, basically they weren't doing their job right on the merits, the kind of classic way that you would justify firing somebody, that it was not that you just disagreed with them or you didn't like them anymore or it was arbitrary, but they actually performed poorly at their tasks, really severe stuff. And these independent agencies, we've had that structure with us. There have been scholars who've pointed out we've had that since the founding. There have been agencies like that where the president can't just remove those people at will. And there was a Supreme Court case in 1935 where President Roosevelt said, no, I want to get rid of that guy. I want to get rid of the head of one of the people who was sitting on the board of one of these independent agencies. And the president was only supposed to be able to get rid of him if this guy was, again, malfeasance, neglect of duty for cause. But President Roosevelt wrote a letter to the guy and he's like, you know what, actually, I just don't want you there anymore because you're not going with my policies. Like, I'm a New Dealer. You're not a New Dealer. I need you out so I can put my guy in. And this man, William Humphrey, said, no, you can't do that. Look, I have this job protection. It's written in the statute. You can't fire me. And Roosevelt said, no, I really do want to fire you. And in fact, I think it is a violation of of the Constitution for Congress to have restricted my power this way. I should have the power to fire anybody who works in the executive branch, because that's part of what it means to have executive power. So Humphrey dies while the litigation is pending. So his executor of his estate takes over, and is still suing for back pay because, Roosevelt removes him. And the lawsuit says he was not allowed to do that. And the Supreme Court ends up getting the case, decides unanimously 9-0 that this law is constitutional, and therefore Congress can set up agencies where the people who head those agencies cannot be removed by the president at will.
And Rachel, just before we move on, because you're explaining so much here, I want to make sure for our listeners and our viewers, they understand what sort of agencies we're talking about.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's what I
the
was gonna ask.
Federal Reserve comes to mind for me as one type of agency like this, but can you just walk through these agencies, and maybe are there distinctions between some of them as well?
Yeah, no, good point. So the Federal Reserve is a great example of an agency like that. So the Board of Governors, the 14 Board of Governors, the president cannot just remove those people because he doesn't like them, because he wants to pressure them to change interest rates, right? We don't have a setup like that. The idea, and most central banks around the world, their central banking agencies, have that kind of protection from political influence. So that's a structure that's fairly common. And the reason it's common is because if a political leader can remove the head of your central bank at will, they will threaten to do that to manipulate interest rates in the market during times where they're facing election. And so economies collapse. It's terrible for that. But in addition to the Fed, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Consumer Products Protection Agency. I can't remember exactly what that is, but making sure products are safe. So there's a bunch of them. And so there's a lot of them that deal with financial stuff, financial related things, but not exclusively. Like you have something like the National Labor Relations Board. And these agencies, the idea behind them when Congress created them was basically like the Fed. You just have some agencies where you really can't have the personnel changing that rapidly, or just because the president doesn't like them. It's the thought is we need more stable policies. And we want these people to serve certain terms, 5-year terms, say, so they develop some institutional knowledge, some expertise, for good policy making and for stability. Since 1935, everybody thought that was okay. That's the cliffhanger. You can go ahead.
So, you're going to get to the Trump administration wants to challenge this whole idea. But let me ask you just a constitutional question. So, many of these, these agencies are actually, all of them, if they have these statutory protections, are created by Congress, right? And
Yes.
I would assume that Congress is using some overlapping Article 1 authority to create them, right? Especially with monetary policy and things like that. Why isn't this a shared power? Like, in other words, yes, I guess you have to put it in a bucket. But our government, our constitutional system isn't necessarily delineated so cleanly into buckets. They blend into each other. And so explain what the constitutional argument is here that Trump is going to make, and what you think is the other side.
Yeah. So I think that the way you described it is the way that for most of the country's history, the way the court saw it, the way people in Congress saw it, and frankly, the way most presidents recognized it as well, that just, Congress has flexibility to set these things up. And once they set it up, then the president administers and executes the law. But the setup is really something that Congress can do, unless there's some constitutional problem with the setup. And Humphreys was the challenge to that, to say, well, wait a minute, can they really do that? Can they make it so that the president can't remove these people? And the court said yes. And I would say starting right about with the end of the Nixon administration, you had a lot of high-profile scholars, lawyers, former Nixon administration officials who were really unhappy with the way Congress responded to Watergate. So, Congress creates a special counsel law. Congress passes an act that says the executive can't impound funds, meaning the president can't decide not to spend money that Congress has appropriated. there's a pushback to this idea that, like, why is Congress doing so much to executive power? And this kind of group of people that had a very strong conception of what the executive gets to do, they're often called unitary executive adherents. And so the idea is that when the Constitution was created and it puts the executive power in the hands of the president, these people argue, well, there's only one president, and that means that all executive power is in the hands of that one person. So it's the unitary theory, and that person needs to be able to remove anyone in the executive branch that doesn't comply with that president's wishes. They read that into executive power, and it became a theory that got lots of adherents in the Federalist Society. It's just been a very popular theory in Republican circles, and definitely in those Republican circles like the Federalist Society, where we've now seen lots of judges and justices come out of. And so they've been drinking that Kool-Aid for a while now. This idea that really presidents need to be able to remove people and in order to exercise the executive power. And because there have been so many judges and justices who have adhered to that, we now have on the Supreme Court several people, I guess we'll find out soon how many, who I think are really very much follow that idea. And starting in around 2010, they started deciding a couple cases where they made it clear that they were going to strike down congressional designs for agencies that don't adhere to that vision that they have, that you got to be able to remove anybody. So they've been chipping around the edges. And soon I think they're going to have to take the issue head on, because the Solicitor General has indicated that she is going to just say, Humphrey's executor, that case, that's wrong. You got to overrule it.
And just to be clear, we often in this podcast talk about all sorts of different things that Trump is doing. And some of them, I would say, don't really have any basis in law at all. Like, you're not going to find necessarily judges who say you should ignore court orders, or you should retaliate against people for carrying out their lawful duties or whatever. But this is actually something, it's fair to say, and I think you've already explained this, but I want to make this clear for our listeners and viewers here, that there are a lot of not only lawyers, but judges who share this vision of the Constitution. And this is more of, I would say, in line with the sort of transformation that Republicans in the Federalist Society have wanted to carry forward for some time.
Yes, so that's all accurate. I don't want to downplay how big of a deal it is, though, just because it's popular. So, that's correct. It's not like this is just his vision and he's kind of, it's singular. But just because it's pervasive doesn't mean it's not bold and, a huge departure from what we had seen before. So it's a pretty revolutionary shift to take a 90-year-old precedent that is the basic architecture of a ton of agencies in government and say, Congress can't do that anymore, including potentially threatening the current structure of the Federal Reserve. So, it's pretty, it is a sweeping idea. So I guess I would put it in the same category it's bolder than this, but it's in the same category of, just a lot of Republicans who had refused to accept Roe versus Wade, from the moment it was decided, and just for 50 years have just kept saying that's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, and then they just needed to get enough justices on the court to overturn it. It's a little bit like that, except it's 90 years, and instead of it being an individual right, it's actually this big structural question about government.
So you mentioned that some of the agencies include things like the Federal Reserve, where you don't want these huge shifts with different changes of administration, right? I would think that that's an interest that any party would share. Like, if you were looking at this from a veil of ignorance of who's going to be in power, it's not something that in other words, you would think there would be more consensus about that. And I know in your note, you mentioned that at least when it comes to the Fed, that even justices who might be sympathetic to this unitary executive theory are going to struggle with, or might struggle with, how to carve out some kind of exception for an agency like that. And can you just talk a little bit more about that? Like, what you see in terms of how this is going to shake out on the Supreme Court, how they would thread that needle, and would it be ideologically consistent for them to do that. I mean, not that this is the most ideologically consistent court, but I'm just I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of how they're going to approach this.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's kind of interesting is so there was a case before Humphreys was decided. This case called Myers. So had you gone to your administrative law class, you would remember those two. Those are the big ones. And in Myers, it was an opinion written by Chief Justice Taft, who you might recall was a former president. And he wrote an opinion in Myers that was similar to this view of executive power. Like, the president's got to be able to fire people. And, there he was talking about the postmaster general. And so by the time you get to Humphreys, the court says, look, jobs like that are different than these agencies that are the administrative agencies that Congress sets up that do a lot of different things, including make rules. So they're kind of quasi-legislative. They sometimes adjudicate claims. So they're quasi-judicial. So for these kind of agencies, the court said, it's different than these purely executive actions that we think of. And what I think is interesting about Myers is, it was written by a former president. And so someone who really just, is thinking about it from the president's perspective. And then you later on, when you get the court that says in Humphreys, no, it's not like that, you have more varied backgrounds of the justices. Fast forward to today, and you really have a Supreme Court just filled with people who only worked in the executive branch. They don't really have a variety of experiences. They were all high-level people who worked for presidents in presidential administrations. And so their point of view is just like very much, what does the president need? So, when you ask like, oh, well, wouldn't everyone agree that we kind of want to, have this kind of stability? I just think they don't have that perspective because they have very little respect for Congress's role. And they're really seeing it from the president's perspective. So they're just seeing it as, look, the president needs this authority to be able to control all the people who work in the executive branch. And, we know that because we worked in the executive branch. So, if you think of Chief Justice Roberts, you think of Justice Kavanaugh, you think of Justice Alito, like these are all people that their experience in government was really focused on presidential powers. So I think that colors their perception of the value of something like this. And they're also, what's the right way to put this? I think they're a little bull in the china shop in terms of just like, if they believe that there's just 3 branches of government and I have a vision that the president needs to control everything in this branch, so be it, so be it. If it's messy, then we just live with that. And I think, that is a foolish way to think about constitutional adjudication. But I do think that is a sensibility that it's not uncommon for them. And last thing I'll say is I do think that they're going to carve out the Fed because as much as I think they love their formal rules and they would like to just say this is nice and clean, they know full well, like if they decide that the Fed doesn't have these protections, that our economy will completely collapse. Like that would be like darkest days, stock market, like collapse, awful. And by the way, I should say in litigation, because Trump has fired so many people, there's cases percolating in the courts where this is coming up and people are saying what's going to happen if the court rules on this. There's a brief that was filed by a bunch of financial regulatory law professors that literally just says, whatever you do, you must say, court, in your decision that this doesn't cover the Fed. Because if you're not clear about it, if like you leave it open or it's not certain, then the market will even tank on that. It'll even just tank on the uncertainty. And the court has had cases in prior terms where this, when they thought about this issue, that where it's come up, and you can always hear the justices are like, how do we carve out the Fed? And there's really no principled way to do it. If their theory is right, the Fed should go. So it does show that they care about practicality, but I think they'll go as sweeping as they can while trying to save that.
That's interesting. Because I will tell you, I had the same thought. I was very interested in hearing you try to articulate a way to carve out the Fed. One thing that I think that it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand is how all these other employees fit into this, because we talked about presidential appointments. We're talking about these very particular agencies. But a lot of our listeners and viewers are hearing about all sorts of federal employees and all sorts of different agencies who are getting fired. What power does the president have to fire those people? What are the limits on that power? I think it's just helpful for people to understand.
Oh, that's really complicated. So that one, so it definitely depends on what positions we're talking about. So you have some people that in the civil service, in the federal government, they have job protections, not like the kind we've just been talking about, where you're going to serve a 5-year term, but they have other kinds of traditional civil service protections where it's the same thing. They should only be removed based on certain performance evaluations, and there's procedures you need to follow before you remove them. And that's all statutory law. They have those protections by virtue of a statute. I think there too, you're going to see President Trump argue that those statutes are unconstitutional. So he's going to say anybody who works for the executive branch, that's in a policy-making role, that's in one of these roles where they're really setting executive policy, that I should be able to remove them. And so those employees will have a different set of arguments to make. So they'll have the same ones to say, no, this law is constitutional, just like what we were talking about before. But they also have due process arguments. They have arguments that say, look, buddy, this statute created a certain interest in my job that I have. Like it's kind of like a property interest. Like Congress said, I get this job unless these things happen and I get these procedures. And so the Supreme Court could decide, look, even if going forward, we think these jobs are the kind of jobs where the president can fire somebody, these people relied on these statutes that gave them certain protections, and the president didn't follow the procedures. And so, some of those firings could be unlawful on that basis. Then there's another group of people who the president could be removing who, so that would be, by the way, an example of that could be something like the inspectors general. He can get rid of them, but he's supposed to give them 30 days notice kind of thing. And they can argue the procedures weren't followed. Or for some of them, they'll have job protections. And
aren't they for cause also?
Well, they can be removed under that act, I believe, if he gives notice as to why he's removing them. I think that's right for those. But each of them, these are all good questions, because basically what you have to do for every one of them is you have to look at the statute that creates the position, and you have to see, what does it say about removing people? What's the standard and what are the procedures? And so the question in each of these cases will be, can the president make a colorable argument that even if the standard says he wasn't allowed to remove them, can he say that's unconstitutional? And then the second argument is, even if he's allowed to remove them, does he have to follow certain procedures, or does it otherwise violate their due process? And then there's an additional argument that could potentially be made in some of these cases. If some of these people want to make an argument that it's like a political retaliation, a First Amendment kind of a claim. There's additional claims that they might be able to make. So I would say we're in for a lot of litigation over the next 4 years. But the big ticket question is this one about how broad is the president's removal power? Because if the court ultimately decides that these statutes are unconstitutional, that's the sweeping decision. The sweeping decision is the one that says to Congress, no matter how valuable you think it is to have protections for people, you can't do it. The president gets to remove them all. And that's a big change, because, in our history in America, we had a lot of really corrupt hiring practices. Tammany Hall here in New York, people might have heard about it. It's like a pay to play kind of thing. You get your jobs because you work for the politician, and it's kind of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And those kind of patronage jobs, that led to terrible policies, really inferior governance. And that's one reason why Congress passed these statutes, was to say, look, we don't want people hired just because they're you're in your political party and you're doing them a favor. We want people to be hired on merit. And so that's why these laws, they're the Merit Protection Board, is to protect people who are hired on merit. And what the Trump administration is basically trying to argue is Congress can't do that anymore. The president can hire people for reasons other than merit. And obviously we're seeing examples of that across the board.
So then what's the check there's just no check. Congress can create the agency, but then it's just simply out of their hands, and we're all at the whim of...
If the Supreme Court says that the president gets the ability to remove anybody at will, then and the court says that's a constitution, that's what the Constitution requires, then our only options are amending the Constitution or appointing enough justices to the court that realize that that's insane and overruling their decision, right? Because again, you can overrule. The other thing I will say is the only reason that we're here right now having this conversation, I think, is that this is a Supreme Court that has shown it doesn't really care very much about precedent, right? Like
No.
the idea that we would be saying, hey, are they going to overrule a 90-year-old precedent that no one challenged up until now, that everyone accepted, that Congress relied on to create hundreds of thousands of jobs and whole government structure? Like, it's insane if you believe in this concept of stare decisis, of adhering to your precedent. There is no way you should overrule that case. But this court has a conception of adhering to precedent that seems to be far less one about stability and predictability. And they have a view, if they think something's really wrong from the outset, they'll overrule it. And so that's going to be the question in this case. Like, do they decide? I know they think it was wrong from the beginning. I know there's 5 justices who believe Humphrey's executor was wrong when it was decided. So the question will be, are there 5 of them who show such little regard for stare decisis that they're going to overrule it?
One thing I'm just curious about is, since we're talking so much about stability, predictability, which is something that we ordinarily think of as important, what impact would this have on our listeners and our viewers if, for example, this law was overturned, or this precedent was overturned, and agencies like this suddenly were operating differently? They were operating more like an arm of the president's office.
So it would be something like, let's take the National Labor Relations Board. It would mean that the president could fire all 5 people at once. None of them have to fill out their term. And usually in these agencies, they serve staggered terms. So, they serve 5 years, and they have different start dates. And so, but what this would allow the president to do, it would be immediately wipe the slate clean and put in 5 people, let's say in the National Labor Relations Board. Presumably these would be 5 people super hostile to labor rights and unions. And so immediately you would get decisions that would really basically squash labor protections. And then take the Securities and Exchange Commission. Again, he could just wipe the slate clean and put in people in the Securities Exchange Commission that are just the people Trump likes, his loyalists. And, there it could be something like, he's got a lot of crypto now, so he could just, it could be a Securities and Exchange Commission that's like, let crypto do whatever it wants, or target in their enforcement actions competitors of Trump crypto. I mean, you get loyalists and you get them in right away, and you don't have any kind of check. There would be some things that would push against that. There are other Supreme Court decisions that say, if an agency has a rule on something, they can't just immediately change it without explaining it. So there would have to be some process for changing rules that would take a little bit of time. But all of this would speed that up. You would very quickly have people put in place that would be loyal to him. And particularly in their enforcement actions, who they go after, who they choose to go after. So again, if they decide that their employer side kind of heads of the NLRB, they could reject union challenges to certain labor practices. At the SEC, they could bring enforcement actions against the companies that Trump doesn't like, as opposed to any of his or any of Elon Musk's. They've already started doing some of that. We see a little bit of that, but it would be much more rapidly doing that across the agencies. And then like the Fed, what you could see is him replacing the board of governors with people who will do whatever he wants. And so he could get people in there who are willing to manipulate the interest rates to time things with elections and things that he cares about.
And in terms of enforcement actions, a lot of those enforcement actions are happening within the executive branch also, right? So what kind of protections do those adjudicators, those admin law judges have? Or would this also impact that? Like, could he just wipe out all immigration judges and, I don't know, bankrupt, whatever?
Yeah, so that's another great question, and also complicated. So the Supreme Court has not definitively indicated how far it's going to go for the people within agencies who adjudicate. Like, if they might have, do they have more protections than the people who are like the heads of the agencies that do the more policy making kinds of things? But it has indicated in some opinions that it might be willing to go that route. And if that's true, you kind of lose the idea of an impartial adjudicate. I mean, it really would sort of taint the nature of the adjudication process. and it's just unclear how far they're going to go with this. I mean, it just goes to show you how many things are up in the air right now, because it's basically every position in government that has any kind of for cause protection. And I should say, the other protection we could have for some of this stuff would be for the people who have to be appointed to these positions. So, these would be anybody who the Constitution deems to be a principal officer. So, someone who's making a lot of policy, has a lot of responsibility. Those people have to get nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So the other check is supposed to be, when they're put in the job in the first place, that there'd be screening for them to, be not these kind of people who will just be loyalists. And so, obviously we have seen that check totally broken, right? Like, so, part of the problem is that you have prior Congresses who recognize that you need to have removal protections, and you have a current Congress that doesn't seem to give a dime about any of its functions and is just letting the president basically wipe the floor with them. So, you don't want to spend the money that we said you have to spend. Okay, well, we're not going to say anything as a Congress. You want to appoint people who are totally unqualified, who we know are unqualified. Well, but you threatened that maybe you'll support somebody against us in a primary. So I guess we'll go along with it. Like, our problem right now is we have such weak members of the president's own party in Congress that is acting as no check at all. They're not protecting their interests at all as a governmental. They don't care about Congress as a Congress. They just care about themselves and their own political careers. So they're not really doing any of the things that I think the framers thought would happen. I think the framers just didn't fully understand how bad political parties would become, and how people would just make decisions based on if they're the same party as the president, as opposed to the fact that, oh, I'm in Congress and you're the president and I should check you. That conception has not played out, I think, the way that they thought it would.
There was a Supreme Court decision, Jarchese, that said that the SEC's admin law judges were unconstitutional, or that admin law system. Do you see that also going to the reach of that expanding to, let's say, our immigration judges and elsewhere?
Yeah. So in that case, the court, so that's one where they kind of did drop the hint that who knows how far they'll go. So in that, I don't know if you say Jarchese, however you say the name of that case, the court there said that there were certain actions that people had that you got a jury trial right. And so therefore you couldn't force them to go before these Securities and Exchange Commission judges, because there was a right to have a jury trial in those cases. And so it's unclear whether that is, the court said, and the reason for that, the court said, was these kinds of fraud actions that were at issue in that case were the kind of actions where you would have gotten a jury at the founding, so they kind of made it about that. So it's not clear whether they would say that you have to have, that every case needs to go into just an Article 3 court, what we all think of as regular courts, as opposed to before an agency judge. If the court actually said that, if the court said actually agencies can't adjudicate things anymore, there's no way our court system could handle all the litigation that takes place in agencies. So, all the Social Security benefits determinations are made by administrative law judges, and the immigration cases, immigration judges. So, if it turned out that those people all had, could be completely removable at will, that would certainly shift things. Or if the court said none of those things can be adjudicated by an agency, it has to all be in a court. It just kind of shows where their vision of separation of powers becomes really troublesome given our current governmental structure, because we don't have a clean division. We don't have a clean division of this is legislative, this is judicial, this is executive. We have all kinds of blending. And even if the court wanted to try to untangle that knot, it's really not possible. We're just too far beyond that. And so that's going to complicate, I think, how far they go with trying to get back to some simpler time. We just have a very complicated government that doesn't really lend itself, I think, to the way they're thinking about it. And we never have, by the way. I mean, the other thing I guess that I think is just worth mentioning here is, there are originalists on the court. There are people who claim they care about, the original meaning and what did things look like at the founding. And, now we have a decent chunk of historical evidence from legal historians who've been looking at this, who've said, there were agencies at the time of the framing where the president couldn't remove the people other than for cause. So, if the founding generation was like, yeah, that's okay, why would it not be okay now? There they're not the world's greatest historians on the Supreme Court, and sometimes they pick and choose which history they look at. But I think that history is really damning for the idea that they have in their mind, which is that no, the president has to be able to remove everybody. And that is one way they could distinguish the Fed, though, because some of those early agencies that had for cause removal protections were like banking, financial kinds of scenarios.
So before we wrap up, you talked about principal officers. Can we talk about DOGE and where Elon Musk fits into our constitutional system? Now, my understanding is that DOGE is basically a repurposed executive branch agency, the U.S. Digital Service, that was created by the executive branch. That's not, I don't believe that was congressionally created.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm sure they get funding somehow from Congress, but I think that's right.
Yeah. And USDS was, I think, created under Obama or whatever. What is even happening?
I don't even know where to begin with that one. I mean, I do know that they have said, the administration has said in court filings, this guy, he's like, they compared him to Anita Dunn and people who worked in the last administration who were just like advisors to the president, like he's just like an advisor to the president who's kind of like around, but he's not in charge of DOGE, which, that is going to require judges around the country. There's kind of a general accepted norm that judges have, which is we take what the executive branch tells us at face value. If the president says something is X, we assume it is in fact X. If the president says, no, I'm not doing this because I want to discriminate against this particular group, even if the president is saying things on Twitter or in other spaces that make it seem like it sure seems like he's doing that, we kind of have this presumption of regularity, that what the official statement is the statement. And so I think the other thing that's going to be a challenge for the courts is how much to say, okay, come on. Like, I understand you say he's not in doing anything, but he seems all over this. And if not him, who, and what is it that they're doing? But the complexity with the DOGE stuff is that, it's a little bit of a circular argument, because if all DOGE was doing was kind of helping to streamline powers that the president already has and has the ability to exercise, then it is more like an advisor like a good IT team, that's just helping the president find stuff. But it seems like what's the biggest legal obstacle with DOGE is that they don't have like a general counsel or somebody who's advising them about what is actually lawful. And so they're kind of going around and they're doing things that aren't things the president can do. And so the legal challenge, I think, will be less about the fact that it's DOGE that did it and more about the fact that the president can't do it, or at least can't do it that way. But I think we'll also... Yes, exactly. Like the impoundment, that's another one. There's an act that says you cannot, the president cannot just refuse to spend the money that Congress has appropriated. And the Impoundment Act says, like, if we've appropriated it, you've got to spend it. But the Trump administration has indicated that they're going to challenge that on constitutional grounds as well.
And that seems like the one thing that Congress as an institution would want to step up for, because that's pretty much their big power.
You would think, but I'm amazed at what they're letting the president do right now without, they all just seem to care about being primaried. And I think they're worried that Elon Musk will fund an opponent, that the president will campaign against them. And, it's pretty craven self-interest, and it's not a lot of institutional interest. But for impoundment, I think it won't matter as much that the members of Congress aren't out there defending it, because that one, interestingly enough, you do have Chief Justice Roberts has, when he was in government, wrote something that indicated he thinks the Impoundment Act is constitutional. And William Rehnquist and Justice Scalia had written things when that indicated they thought it was constitutional. And since, it's a group of conservatives that that, I think they think highly about what Rehnquist or Scalia would have said about something. So that one, I actually think the court might say that the Impoundment Act is constitutional. And I think that might be the one win that Congress gets. So they won't have the ability to design agencies with job protection, but they will be able to say that the president has to spend the money. That one, if it's going to, I think the bigger issue is what happens if the president defies the court's orders.
Yeah. I think that's important because otherwise you could imagine essentially a pocket veto of sorts by a president, right? Congress wants to build a highway. They appropriate the money for the highway. And the president's like, you know what? Even though that has already been signed into law, I don't care. I'm just going to not essentially direct the executive branch not to do it, which is a real problematic thing.
Yeah, I mean, then it's just it's taking Congress to the point that I don't even know why it's there. If the power of the purse,
Right.
that it's just meaningless to have that. Then they are like just some kind of roving advisory body that takes up space. So I think the court. I mean, it's always hard to predict, but if I had to, I would predict they are going to overrule Humphrey's executor, but they're going to carve out an exception for the Federal Reserve. And I would predict that they would say that the Impoundment Act is constitutional, and therefore it's not that the president has unlimited discretion to just decide not to spend money. But we'll see. Yeah.
I mean, if the president can impound funds and not obey court orders, then you basically have a dictator.
Yes. We yes, and and then there's really no point in analyzing the fine point of any of these cases. At that point, we are really in a whole new territory.
It's complicated.
Yes.
Well, Asha, that was an interesting conversation, but not nearly as crazy as what happened in the Oval Office today, because we are recording this on Friday, the 28th.
Yeah, so this happened when I was in the air. I was flying to Atlanta, which is where I am now. That's why I'm in a hotel room. We'll talk about that in the C block. And so I'm looking through the, crack in the chair in front of me, and the guy sitting in front is watching Fox News, and it talks about the heated exchange between Trump and Zelensky.
And Pence.
And Vance.
Yeah,
not Pence. Not Pence. Poor Pence.
Yeah, Pence is on the good side. On the good side on this one, Pence is actually out there tweeting saying, "Hey, Mr. President, actually, Ukraine didn't start this war." No, so they're basically bullying and acting in a demeaning way towards the president of Ukraine, which is shocking and is the sort of thing that we've never seen before, I would say, in American history.
So, full disclosure, I did not watch the clip with the sound on because I just can't bring myself to do it. But I have read the words and I have watched the demeanor. It's not just shocking, it's shameful. It's shameful. Look, even at the basic level of diplomacy and how you conduct yourself as a head of state with another head of state. I mean, do presidents and vice presidents behave this way? It looked so just gross, and so base. It looked so base. Like, it's not befitting the kind of interaction that you would want. Even if you disagree, you expect there to be a certain kind of decorum and civility in the way that you communicate that. And it seemed more like a performance. Even with the sound off, maybe especially with the sound off, it looked more like a performance to me.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely even beyond diplomacy. It showed a lack of civility to the point that we wouldn't treat like a guest in our home that way. Right?
Correct.
And so if somebody came to my home for any reason, I would not treat them in that manner. And it's sort of the level of disrespect is really something. And it is shocking. And it really, leads me to wonder once again, what is animating this strong desire to pursue Russia's interest, right? I mean, it's something that a question you and I have noodled for years and years and years. But it sure looks like someone who is trying to essentially push forward Russian propaganda points and humiliate someone who is standing up and a symbol of defiance to Russia.
Yeah, this is something that has been in the works for a long time. I mean, to me, it's shocking that it's manifesting in this way, but let's remember that the seeds of this were planted in 2016 when the GOP platform, the position on Ukraine and sending arms to Ukraine was diluted. Do you remember this?
And that was at the believe at the behest of Paul Manafort, or he was somehow involved in that, correct?
Yes. And so, it got airtime, but not enough, I think, as much as it deserved, because it was such a sharp departure from the GOP stance, which had been very, very hawkish up until that point. It was just like, oh, yeah, I guess it's kind of weird that, all of a sudden we've softened the position on arms to Ukraine. And then, we had the whole Russia investigation, which, by the way, again, everything comes home to roost today, where Trump says, Putin and I, we went through this witch hunt together, or we went through some things together. I mean, there's this, there's a sense of like, yeah, they did this to us. Like they were going to expose us. I mean, it's weirdly kind of confession-y to me. And all of this is really, there's a clear through line from that moment in 2016 at the convention to the midpoint where he tries to do the quid pro quo shakedown, withholding arms and weaponry to Ukraine before Zelensky announces an investigation, to today. Like, it's not shocking. The only thing that's shocking, to kind of link it to our earlier segment, is Trump knows he can do this now and pay zero political price for it. Whereas during the first administration, he had to tiptoe around it and try to create this plausible deniability because there were still enough people who were Russia hawks. And now the entire GOP has just capitulated.
Yeah, I mean, if you recall, there was an earlier Oval Office episode near the beginning of his first presidency where he essentially stated some intelligence to the Russian ambassador, and it was a shocking event. And that was very different than this. It was not in front of the cameras, and it was not.
Well, he let the Russian press in. He didn't let the
American press. Yeah.
Yes, or maybe he didn't let the American press in. I don't know if the Russian press was there, but today the Russian press was there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yes, he brought in Sergei Lavrov like in the first week and was like yucking it up. And maybe it wasn't the first week. I think it was after he fired James Comey. It was like, yeah, I took care of that guy.
So one thing I will say is one thing that, because I obviously am practicing law and out there talking to a lot of different people, it's been interesting hearing people try to make sense of the Trump foreign policy. I mean, the best story I heard recently is like, well, they're trying to peel away Russia from China. Like, this is like Nixon going to China thing where, he was trying to during the Cold War. And I'm like, boy, that is a really difficult way to try to explain this escapade.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
Well,
that was Vivek Ramaswamy's debate talking point. And
right. Like, China's the true enemy, and we need to triangulate that and sort of isolate China by getting Russia, which shares a huge border with them, to sort of be at odds with them. Okay. This just doesn't seem at all like a coherent and well thought out strategy of any kind. I mean, belittling and berating a world leader who's respected by many of our allies and partners, at the very least, even if the current president and vice president don't respect him, is very odd.
Yeah. We are watching as our entire world order is being reconfigured, essentially.
Indeed.
And I think to connect it to some of what we talked about earlier and this idea of huge concentrations of executive power, that one thing that we should be very cognizant of is abuse of executive power can come both in the commission of acts, launching investigations against enemies and doing things, as well as in the omission of acts. And I think that we don't think about that enough. So, we talked about one form of omission if, for example, the Impoundment Act is declared unconstitutional, like to just not spend money that, he's given, to not investigate crimes if they're being committed by his friends, to not deploy forces if Putin were to, attack Poland. And even though under NATO, we are under our treaty required to provide assistance, to simply say, no, we're not going to do that. He has all of that authority. And I think we don't really understand, or I think most people don't fully appreciate how much an abuse of power can come through omission as well as commission.
Yeah, it's interesting. Legally, is much more difficult, I'll say, as a prosecutor to prosecute omissions.
Correct.
It's even in, let's say, a fraud case, it's rare that an omission is prosecuted as a fraud. Like even if you omit a statement that would be, or a disclosure that would be very important. And similarly in this context, it can be very challenging to hold a president accountable. Asha, it's a subject. It's interesting because obviously you just said something that's so profound that, our whole world order is being reconfigured. And yet on this podcast, we're so focused, understandably, on our entire nation and our way of life and our constitutional system being reconfigured. And it's almost like, people are focused on at home first, right? And what's all the turmoil here before the impact in the rest of the world. But of course, some of the people who will suffer the most from a Trump presidency are the people of Ukraine.
Totally. I have found myself experiencing deep shame over the last few weeks, and definitely as things definitely as we were like cutting off aid to, starving babies in Sudan, or, but for sure, as this has come to backing Russia in its obviously illegal war. I mean, everybody saw that was unprovoked. It was a violation of international law. The United States voted with Russia in the United Nations against condemning Russia for that invasion. I mean, to me, that was hugely shameful. Like, I thought that was kind of rock bottom. But, as someone who grew up, I think really, I have drunk the America Kool-Aid. I mean, this is why I joined the FBI. Like, I have always believed in the shining beacon on a hill, this idea that it's the idea of America, it's the promise of America. And I'm really sad. I'm really sad because I feel like we're not the good guys anymore.
So
we're bad guys, actually.
So, that's interesting. I also, like you, am a believer in America. I love America. I'm so proud to be an American. But I don't feel shame for Trump's actions, because personally, I did everything I could to try to oppose his reelection. And I feel like I have stood against that. And I just think that, it's unfortunate. But he is acting against our constitutional system and a lot of the things that I do hold very dear. But I don't feel as personally responsible. I just can't. I don't take any responsibility for him. I just feel like I can't. And so he's not. I mean, he. Yes, I understand that he was elected, and I respect the fact that is how the election was resulted. But he's not. He's not speaking for me. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I was at the National Constitution Center conference last weekend, and Yuval Levin gave a speech, and he actually said something that I thought was really profound. And it's this, he was saying that the president actually doesn't represent everyone. The president is there to be essentially like a steward of the nation, but not necessarily like the the representative of everybody's will. That's what we have Congress for. That's why we have our actual representatives. And it was a really interesting way to think about how we have reimagined the president. And I guess the shame that I do feel is that I do think that people see the president as kind of embodying what America is, and hopefully, as long as we still can, we can still, in our individual capacities, say what we believe and speak out against it. But yeah, it's a sad time right now.
It is. So, Asha, before we go, what have you been up to?
So as I mentioned, I was flying to Atlanta. I was in flight. I was coming to Atlanta. I'm here for a wedding of a family friend, their kid. My dad's here, and I've joined him because it's an Indian wedding, and Indian weddings are fun. And sometimes you need a distraction, and this seemed like a good one.
So I absolutely love Indian weddings, partly because I love Indian food. That is probably my favorite cuisine. To my mom's chagrin, I am much more into Indian food than I am Italian food.
Oh no, does she listen to this podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Like, from time to time. And she knows this. I've taken her to Indian restaurants many times. So what the cool thing about Indian weddings to me is not just all the food, but it's like such a cool spectacle, and it's like a whole thing, right? I mean, and it's often, if you're involved in a wedding party, like multiple days. Like I've had to go early, and there's all these events, and yeah.
Yeah, so it's, I'm only here till Sunday, but I have a huge suitcase behind me because I had to pack like multiple outfits because there's many costume changes.
I love it.
And especially because this is an interfaith wedding. And so there's like kind of additional events because there's like, the Christian ceremony, then there's the Hindu ceremony, and then there's something in between. I don't know. So anyway, I just packed a lot of outfits. I packed things that can go Indian, things that can go.
Wow. It's not all saris then.
Yeah. I do have a sari. So saris are tricky because, just a little sartorial lesson here. I know a lot of non-Indians call like all Indian, all female Indian clothing saris, but the sari is actually the 6 yards of cloth that you wrap around and all of that. But those are the trickiest. Those are highly susceptible to wardrobe malfunctions. And
makes sense.
Yeah, and they're I have figured out how to put one on, but I will only wear that to the actual ceremony, and then I have to change into something else. So if you look carefully at the reception, except for the aunties who could totally know how to dance in a sari, usually the younger, generation women are wearing a lenga.
Oh.
And that is a much more secure kind of outfit.
And speaking of someone who has been to multiple Indian weddings and danced at them, I did not even notice this. So this is a Westerner's perspective, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the lenga is like has a drawstring waist, and it's got like the fun blouse or whatever. And then there's the kurta pajama, which is the long tunic with the pants underneath. And that both men and women have their versions of that.
That's interesting. Okay, well, one last question before we go. Is there going to be an elephant or a horse or something at this wedding?
I don't know. Are you allowed to have elephants in the U.S. for weddings?
So it's tricky.
You just have an elephant going down some random street in Georgia?
There are people who have them. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not timing anybody out, but it has occurred. But
you've been to an Indian wedding in the U.S. where they've ridden an elephant?
I've been to 2 where they did the horse.
Horses, yeah, I know the horses. Sometimes it's like a Corvette or something, and then they're doing the things around
Corvette. Oh my god.
Or whatever, some sports car. I've seen that. I've seen the horse. I don't know that I've been to one that has an elephant. I feel like that's illegal, probably.
Well, it's the whole, just everyone is like the grooms, like posse comes in, right?
Yeah. So the idea is the reason that is happening is that the groom is coming to the bride's village. Like they have traveled all of this way. So the big procession is kind of the symbolism there is that the groom is coming to the bride's village, and they have traveled, on elephant, for miles and miles, and so they're being welcomed as they come.
Sure.
In. That's why that's the big party
Got
at
it.
that moment.
Well, as yes, as somebody who's usually coming as part of the groom's entourage, I've had a lot of experience with that. So
yeah, I'll report back later.
sounds good. Sounds like a lot of fun.